Welcome to Season 3 of the Moving On Podcast. I'm Jay Norman, and this is my wife.
Hi, I'm Jess Norman.
Babe, did you really think anybody would hang around to listen to a third season?
What is a really good word for the opposite of yes?
My thoughts exactly. And thank y'all for hanging around.
We sure appreciate it.
And on to the show. Hi, babe.
Hi.
How are you?
Why'd you think I was supposed to say hello first?
I was just giving you a chance.
It would be my first time to say hi ever.
Yeah, we might want to break the mold then.
Or did I say it in your episode?
Possibly.
Several friends have said after they listened to Cam's episode, our most recent episode, that they went back and heard yours.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I hope
Actually, Cam and I listened to about an hour of it
Really?
the day together. It's good. It's a good episode.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm trying to get through Cam's.
Yeah.
I haven't had time to get it done.
You haven't heard it yet?
Nope, there goes your air conditioner.
I think it'll be okay.
Babe, we just recorded about 3 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had anything exciting happen since then?
Yes, so much.
You have?
How much time do you have?
Not much, but go ahead.
I do know that this is how I describe it. Cam came in town, and it was almost like we pressed pause on everything. I mean, we met our requirements with the kids and stuff, but as far as like laundry or keeping up the house or groceries, and we also went out of town. We took her to the stockyards for a few days, and so when she left, Jay says we've been burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah.
So she left on Tuesday afternoon. My car broke down on the way to the airport to take her to the airport. And Calvin had to drive one of our guys from our farm crew had to drive from the farm to help fix our car. He's so good. And Wednesday and Thursday were both just a blur.
Yeah, it's gone by in a hurry. And
Yeah.
Seems like a lot's gotten done, but
Yeah.
a lot more needs to get done for sure.
Yep, but today's been really nice. We've gotten some things done, made it to the post office, and you've had a really busy day today.
Yep, today was drop dead tax day for us late filers, so I had to get that finished today and get everything signed and make the accountant happy, and did get that done, for at least as far as I know anyway.
Yep, you've had a whole different attitude today.
Yeah, ready to be done with it.
I have to just ignore you because I think you're like mad at me, but you're just mad at someone else.
Uncle Sam.
What?
Uncle Sam.
You're not supposed to. You will get canceled.
Oh, sorry.
Great. We
Sorry
just
about
got
that.
canceled.
Yeah, you've been waiting on it since we started.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So farming-wise, we got 2.5 inches of rain since we last recorded, so that's a good thing for us to actually be on the podcast and not be talking about too much rain.
Right.
Is nice. And so we got 2.5 inches. Probably by then about 4 days, I hope we'll be planting wheat. Mm-hmm. Be willing to get that done.
Good.
And working cattle 2 or 3 days before that, so we're getting caught up pretty good for now until this wheat plant starts.
Right.
It'll be probably 9-0 from here to Thanksgiving. So
Yes.
we're ready.
Yep, we're ready. You know, do you want to hear something so funny? When Cam flew home, it snowed. The whole day, my head kept going, what a late snow. What a late snow. Do y'all usually get snow this late in the year? It took me till the evening to realize it's an early snow. It's not a late snow.
You'd already gone through winter.
I had just put us back at like June or May or June. And I'm not kidding. When I realized it, I got so tickled. I was like, it's just a blur. The whole year is gone.
Yeah, we're basically a month from Thanksgiving. So
I just kept thinking, I can't believe they've had such a late snow.
yeah, that's pretty crazy. Baby. You lost track of time for
Yeah.
sure. So you mentioned Cam, and that'll be the
Yes.
episode before this, Cam
Yes.
Elliott, and that was a lot of fun doing that.
Right.
You met Cam on Instagram. Mm-hmm. So today we have another guest
Yes.
who you also met on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very interesting.
Oh, I love Instagram.
Evidently you do.
Evidently, I trust Instagram.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you've had good luck.
And who they want me to have as my people.
Yeah, you've had
because they
good luck.
handpick them for me.
They do.
Yeah.
So why don't you introduce our guest tonight?
So I guess over the summer, you guys know that we went through a pregnancy loss. Jay and I found out that we were pregnant. We were not trying to get pregnant. It was a huge surprise. We went through a few moments of surprise and entered directly into more excited than we'd been ever.
Yeah.
And a few months into the pregnancy, we found out that we had lost the baby, and it was something that we would never really known. It was almost like God pulled a curtain back on an issue that I was completely ignorant to.
Yeah.
And a community of folks that I was completely ignorant to, which was hard because there were members of my family that I didn't even know to help or comfort or jump to their need because, like I said, there was just an ignorance there until you walk through it. And so through the loss came such immediate beauty. And through those first few weeks, hundreds of you wrote and sent flowers and sent cards and books and text messages. And there was this one day my buddy started talking to me about our loss, and he and I talk a good bit. But there was this one day where it was audio after audio after audio, and you can record a full minute, I think, on audio. And when I answered my phone, I think there were about 14 or 15 audios. And so I just sat down in our bedroom floor and I just pressed play. And it was the most beautiful story I've ever heard, the most honored I've ever felt hearing a story. And I sat there and I just asked God, why me? Like, why me? Why do I get to sit in my bedroom floor and hear the deepest, most secret parts of my friend's heart? Like, what makes me that special that I get to hear that? And I just felt so honored. And I called Jay and I said, do you mind if I ask him to be on our podcast? And so I did, and he took some time to pray about it and talk to his buddies about it, and he got back with me and agreed, thankfully. And so my buddy, Luke, is in from Roundrock, and I am so excited that he's here. I cannot wait for y'all to hear his story, and I'm honored that God would intersect all of our paths because of how just true of a heart and soul that he is, and you guys are going to be blessed by him tonight too.
Luke, welcome.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you tonight.
It's good to be here.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to come out and taking the time to be on our podcast and tell your story. And so I think it's pretty amazing going back to Instagram. Like Jess said, God put her people in front of her, that the friendships that she's made that's allowed me to, to meet a lot of people and hear a lot of amazing stories. But I think your story, the timing of it's pretty amazing to how it, it intersected our life and through Instagram. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of where you're from and how you grew up and all that good stuff?
Sure. Well, first things first, I am from Roundrock, Texas. I actually run a landscaping company there in Roundrock, and been doing that now this will be our 4th full year running that full time. So it's been an exciting adventure thus far, and but overall, I am there's different points from y'all's story that intrigued me as I listened into y'all's podcast over the last few months. I come from a divorced family. I was a kid of divorce. I've had my own divorce, and I've also had losses as far as infant loss, and that portion of my life has really become a very deep point of ministry, essentially. And so when I saw y'all's story come across Instagram that you had lost, it was like just this giant bell began to ring saying you've got to jump in. And so I did. I blew right into those DMs like nobody's business.
I'm so thankful you did.
Yeah.
And so it's been just as amazing on my end to be able to interact with you guys. And it happens quite a bit as you make those connections. This is a community that, as I told Jess, it's a club that nobody wants to belong to. Mm-hmm. The moment you find out that you're in that club, you realize that there's a lot of people in that club.
There's a bunch more than you ever knew.
So, Luke, saying all that, and a step back for just a second, and I like the story of, we talked about how you met on Instagram, but I think it's pretty unique how you found us and tracked us down. So why don't you tell that story too? You mentioned listening to our podcast, but how did you originally find it?
Absolutely. So I came to you guys by way of. So a couple years ago, I came across a dairy farmer in Oregon by the name of Derek Josie. And through him, I discovered that he was on a podcast produced by Rob Sharkey.
Oh, we don't say that name on this podcast.
Oh, well.
Could you come up with a code name, a surname?
Sir Sharkey?
Sir Sharkey.
So
our ratings tend to plummet anytime that name is mentioned.
I could see why.
So, shoot.
He's not going to like that.
So through Sharky's podcast, found out that they were coming onto y'all's podcast. And I'm always looking for new podcasts, new people to listen to. And so listened to that episode, said, hey, these hosts sound pretty good. And got in there and started listening. And I'm one of these people who, whenever I find a podcast, no matter where I joined, I go back to the very beginning and I start listening from the very beginning and bringing myself back up. And so that's what I begin to do. However, typically I have a tendency to, I guess you'd say, binge a podcast to the point where I'm completely caught up. But I would listen to 3 or 4 or 5 episodes, and then I would take a break. And then 2 or 3, 4 more episodes, and I'd take a break. And I like to think, when I look back at that, God's timing was perfect, because even though those podcasts had been recorded months, maybe even years prior to me coming across them, they were right for me in that moment.
Right.
And there were several different ones that would come across, and each time a good one would come across, I would always reach out. And so it's been pretty crazy. It's been a wild ride, just, kind of finding you guys and then, catching up to this point.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, we're a blended family. You listen to the podcast, and so, that's a lot of what it's about. Obviously, our loss has brought another facet to it and to our life, and obviously something that's affected you. But you grew up in a divorced family. Why don't you tell us that story? I think you said your parents divorced when you were in 7th grade.
That's correct, yeah. So in 7th grade, my parents divorced. My mom moved us kids from my hometown of Brady, Texas, to San Angelo, Texas. And for me, San Angelo was an okay move. It wasn't that great. San Angelo isn't necessarily geared towards kids. Kind of a military town, kind of a college town. And so then eventually Mom moved us up to the Austin area. And from there, just in that dynamic of kind of moving around, I began to see 2 totally different facets as far as, from Dad's side and Mom's side. And it wasn't until all of the kids were adults that my dad got remarried. And that's a little bit different. You're not necessarily living with the step parent. You're not really involved in that as much as an adult. And so then his second wife passed away, and then he got married a third time. And Renee has really been pretty good as far as, just us getting to know each other. And then, and we'll get into this a little bit later down the line, my father passed away earlier this year. and just the closeness that has still been there has been kind of crazy, but it's relieving because God had all of that planned out. God has figured, well, he hasn't figured it out. He had it figured out from the very beginning. But he's finally chosen to, let me see on the other side sometimes,
Sure.
So, but yeah, growing up, basically now under a single parent to that point, it definitely shaped me as far as being able to understand certain hardships, being able to see certain things through, one person's eyes. And then later, as life drew me and my father closer together, beginning to see kind of another facet to that point that would eventually round me out as far as my view of divorce, my view of how much grace is really needed in a process like that. So when it came to my own divorce, I was able to look at that in a whole totally different light than I would have, say, even at the beginning of my marriage. So that process in itself has been pretty eye-opening.
So your parents' relationship, go ahead, babe.
I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
We talked about that today, how divorce, that refining fire that you walk through, we don't want to promote divorce by any means, but what I was telling Luke today is sometimes we have to find a silver lining to be able to breathe post-divorce, and that can come across as promotion. So I always have to clarify, this is not promotion. This is just how we've thrived afterwards, but just to see that what a refining fire the divorce can be for a person, and how it changes the trajectory of one's life, and not always necessarily in a negative path.
Correct.
So you mentioned your parents' relationship and the knowledge and strength that you gained from how your dad handled situations, and we get into that a lot and heard that from people on here about, how their parents handled situations as a divorced kid, and you might address that a little bit.
Absolutely. So there's always, I was always told there's a side A, there's a side B, and then there's truth.
Sure.
And oftentimes you don't know the full truth until you've heard side A and side B.
Well, and I fully believe that side A is not trying to lie and side B is not trying to lie. They fully, from their standpoint, see it that way.
Yep, absolutely. And from one person's viewpoint, there may be more hurt, there may be more pain that's involved in that shapes their outlook, versus the other person. Maybe they're given more to grace. Maybe they're given more to understanding. And maybe they've even come to the understanding that they were the problem or they were the cause of some of that pain. And yet they can look across that and not only give forgiveness to themselves, but also give grace to the other person because of the pain that was endured. And pointedly, from my dad's side of view, he would often tell us that if we had a problem, and this wasn't just with my mom, it was with many other things. If ever there was a problem, you don't go and tear that person down. You go and you pray for that person. You pray for your own heart to accept that. And then you go and you talk to that person. And that in itself really brought to me, especially as the older I get and the more circumstances evolve, that really has brought home to me just how important it is to look at everything through the shadows, through the glasses of grace. Because as humans, we don't just hurt, but y'all said it on this a lot of times, hurt people hurt people. And knowing that we have the capacity to hurt, we also should know that we have the capacity to help heal. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And just by siding on that side of grace or on that side of forgiveness can oftentimes lift chains that some people may not even realize that they had to begin with. Mm-hmm. And that's been something that's come forth in a couple of different instances mm-hmm. where certain things are said, certain things are done, and on my end, I'm hurt because of what's been said about somebody else. And I can take and turn that around and be able to look at that and say, obviously they're hurting. Obviously they're still hurting, even now, years past whatever has happened. Mm-hmm. And for me, as my brother told me one time, is the fight worth the stink at the end? Yeah. And for me to look at that and realize, what am I carrying here? Am I carrying hurt or pain because of what was said, or am I carrying hurt and pain because of something was said about somebody that I care about? Mm-hmm. And that does change the dynamic, because when we feel like we're going to bat for somebody else, there's somewhat of a righteous indignation that rises up. It doesn't necessarily make it right sometimes. Sometimes we are called to turn the other cheek. We are called to extend that olive branch. Mm-hmm. And so just through some of the things that have come from the lessons taught through my parents' divorce, I can look back now mm-hmm. and really understand that what I was taught wasn't just a lesson. It really was a legacy. Mm-hmm.
It was.
That if we carry grace from the very get-go and we extend that because we've been given it, that does a lot to undo a lot of wrongs mm-hmm. and does a lot to turn somebody towards healing.
Mm-hmm. Amen. That'll preach.
Yeah, that'll preach for sure.
It was so good.
Yeah, that'll preach for sure.
And that's all. Good night, everybody.
That was a great show. Well, and I think too, you saying that, and my simple way of saying and thinking about it is, and we've been through it a lot, is just, you say things when you're hurt, and now I can hear people say things when they're hurt, and I know that 5 years down the road they're going to wish they hadn't have said that, or just they may have said it. Yeah, you just have to let it go and know that over time it's gonna work itself out. They're going to come around, but it's out of your control, and you just have to let the Lord handle it as He handles it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I've been learning lately that first wave of impulse, the first way you want to react immediately in such a negative manner, that's your inherited. That's kind of how you were raised. Any of the trauma from anything that you've experienced, that comes in that first wave. And if you can just get through that first wave, pause, and get to the second wave, that's when you get to what you've been working on. That's when that strength comes in and that growth comes in and the flexing of the self-control that you've been desperately trying to flex each, experience. And so just trying to more and more every day skip the first wave and get to the second wave. And that's essentially what drop the rope is. Yeah. It just stop the tug of war and cover the dark with light and the hate with love. If the first wave is, I'm going to match that hate with hate and that dark with dark, and that's just never going to work. Well,
and you're not always, when you drop the rope, you're not. Yeah. You may be 2 years from getting thank you for dropping that rope in certain instances, for sure.
And in fact, the only way, if you match hate with hate, the only way that's going to work is if their next move is love. Yep. If someone has to come, someone's move has to involve love or light.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sound like your dad was pretty good at pointing that out.
Yeah.
I would have to say absolutely.
Yeah. That's great. So, moving forward in your story, you were married sometime 18 years ago, roughly. Why don't you tell us about that and what battles you faced there? I know you had a lot of hardships in that deal. And so why don't you tell us that story?
Sure. So, got married in December of 2003. And from the onset, there were certain different things that came up, as far as there was a health concern on my end for a bit. There was a car accident on her end that left her partly disabled. And then our biggest struggle, and ultimately the biggest obstacle, was around pregnancy. And for 10 plus years, we had tried to get pregnant, and that had just not ever come about. And so from that, we turned to medical science. We turned to IVF. And through that process, we began to finally see results, even though from there, still more miscarriages, more losses, more setbacks, as we finally begin to get closer to that mark, so to speak. And finally, in 2013, we had what was believed to be a viable pregnancy, and we had reached the 12-week mark, and everything was looking really good. So they turned us loose from the IVF facility over to our regular doctor, and everything was going really good. 18 weeks came and went. We're doing good. Things are looking great. We find out we're having a little girl. And the excitement around that, because on both sides of the family, this would be the first granddaughter. And so to be carrying that essentially was pretty exciting. And then just a couple of days before we reached the 20-week mark, my wife woke me up in the middle of the night on July the 5th. Would have been the morning, very early morning of July 5th, 2013. And her water had broke. And so we went to the hospital. And sure enough, it was confirmed that full abruption. And at the moment, our daughter was laying face down in a pool of amniotic fluid, and that was basically the thing that was keeping this thing together. And the doctors that paraded through that room, the people that were reached out to, it was a parade almost. It was a show, because the hospital that we were in, they had neonatal specialists, but there were better ones in Austin, and we were in Roundrock at the time, so they called the ones in from Austin, gave them permission to come into that hospital and treat our case. And those doctors came in and ran more and more tests and more scans. And they began to reach out to doctors in New York, doctors in Chicago, doctors in LA. And ultimately we were told that the fate of our daughter was laying face first in a pool of amniotic fluid, and whether or not the pregnancy would be allowed to continue by the body. And that night, so we had gone from 2 a.m. of July the 5th till 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night on July the 5th. And at that moment, we began to realize that this pregnancy was coming to an end. And over the next several hours, things began to progress pretty rapidly. And at 12:33, July the 6th of 2013, my little girl was born. And the doctors had told us that at 20 weeks, there's no viability there because lung buds do not begin to form until 24 weeks. And if she survived the birthing process, we would get maybe 15 minutes. And so with that bit of information, we had the tendency to be a little selfish, and I don't blame us, honestly, because at that point, if I'm only going to get 15 minutes with my daughter, then I want that 15 minutes. Elizabeth Grace Cowen was born with a fighting heart, and that little heart just beat like a drum on fire. And an hour later, that little heart is still going. And so at this point, we reached out to our pastor and his wife, and they came up to the hospital to spend time with us. And we're 2 hours in, and the little heart is still going. It's not as fast anymore. And as time began to wind down, the pastor and his wife dismissed themselves, handed her back to me, and as I made that walk to take her back to my wife, I felt that little body shudder, and I knew she was gone. And in that moment, I knew everything was still okay. In the preparation of getting her ready for company to come up, so to speak, our nurse had brought in a number of different things as far as receiving gowns and blankets and stuff. And in that pile of stuff, as I'm looking through it while they're in the process of bathing her and getting her cleaned up, this little purple crocheted butterfly falls out of the midst of everything. And I gasped, and the nurse turns and sees what it is, and she said, "I don't know why I put that there, but I felt like it was needed, but if it's causing problems, I'll take it away." And I told her no. Because nobody in that hospital knew that we were in the process of getting ready to decorate her nursery in blue and purple butterflies. And the nurse didn't realize that the reason why she brought that butterfly into that room was because God had put it there. And I can look back on all of that turmoil, all of that pain, all of that suffering, and I can say without a shadow of a doubt that God was in the middle of that. And from that moment, my life has been 100% changed by a little girl that never raised a finger, by a little girl that never said a word, and yet spoke such loud volumes during that short 2.5 hours of her life, from 12:33 p.m. to 2:59 p.m. Elizabeth Grace changed my world, and from that has changed different parts of the world, because just now as I'm sitting here and I'm telling this story, I have told this story hundreds of times to other couples who have lost, to other couples who struggle, to other couples who are caught up in that pit of infertility. And so I can look at that and I can say truly in the moment I felt held, but I didn't feel great about it. And you don't have to. earlier in the evening, the nurse had come in and she looked me in the eye and said, "You've been here all day and you're going to leave. And you're going to go take a couple hours. You're going to get something to eat. You're going to do whatever you need to do. And then you're going to come back." And I remember getting in my truck, driving on the way home, and pulling over on the side of the road and screaming at God, "Why? Why are we having to go through this?" And to this day, I still don't know why. But I still know God. And God, the sovereign one, had a reason for every bit of that. Eventually, from that point, our marriage would end in divorce. And I won't say that it's solely because of that. But I will tell you that statistics say that couples who suffer infant loss, the likeliness of that marriage ending in divorce doubles from the regular rate. And the odds are stacked against you from the moment that happens. As time went on and our marriage came to an end, I began to realize that there was so much more in store for who I was and who I am, that even though I'm now faced not only with the loss of my daughter, I'm faced with the loss of my marriage. I can remember certain points all throughout, moments where I struggled deeply with both losses, moments where I felt 100% isolated, moments where I felt that I was all alone. For 9 months after the divorce was filed, I never stepped foot back into a church. There were certain things that took place upon the filing of divorce, and I won't get into that, but it caused me to step away. And yet, God wasn't done. And so, Christmas Eve of 2017, a cousin of mine, when I went back home to be with my dad for Christmas, a cousin of mine reached out to me who had been in prison, had accepted Christ as his personal Savior in prison, reached out to me and said, "Hey, let's go to church." And he didn't know. He didn't know that I wasn't in church, didn't know that I had stepped out of church, didn't know any of that, and I didn't tell him until we were sitting in the parking lot waiting for the church doors to open. And he listened to that story, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you think that God saves me to bring you back?" And I said, "With God, all things are possible." Yep. And sure enough, in that service, a word was put into a preacher's heart, and those words were put across a microphone and into my ears, and God said, "It's time to come back home." And so I did. And from that point, the opportunities that I've had to tell this testimony, the opportunities that I've had to encourage others that no matter how dark or how deep that hole goes, there's still somebody in control. And I can only ever look back on all of that and say that God's hand's been in it the whole time. Mm-hmm.
That's a story. Get you something to drink.
our first ever intermission.
Testimony of all testimonies. Need a break? Sure.
Sorry I made you cry.
Well, it's just one that's got to be told.
Yeah.
That's a 42. 42.
You okay, Luke?
Yeah.
You okay? That's about close to home as you can get, huh?
Cool.
Okay. I just want to say, coming back, that we had to take our first ever intermission. Just because that's a amazing story, testimony, and we're not done. And we had to take an intermission to regroup and go again. And you said something earlier today, long about this time when we talked in the story about how much good has come from the bad. And I mean, that's about as rough a bad as you can tell right there. I mean, that's a tough story. So God's taken good from bad. You've walked through all that, and it leads you to, I know you told us about counseling, a lot of time with your pastor, but then it ultimately leads you to take that testimony, as you mentioned, talking to hundreds of people. Tell us about that good from bad and what it led to, and the people you've talked to, and then, we'll talk about that when we get to the end of it. It ultimately comes up to where, it gets us to this point right here.
Well, as you mentioned, there was a lot of healing that I still needed to do as I came back into the church. And I sat down with a man who has become one of my dearest friends at this point, our soul care pastor at our church, Lee Lewis. And him and I talked. We've talked a bunch, but we talked, and his viewpoint was making sure that from all the different losses that I gave time for grief, that I gave time to allow wounds to begin to close up and heal. And to him, one of the greater things that he felt would probably help me would be to start telling that story on a regular basis, start reaching out, start sharing those viewpoints of God was in the middle of all that thick. And so through different programs of the church, through different infant loss support groups hosted by hospitals all throughout the Austin area, through conversations with friends, conversations with friends of friends who brought their friends because, hey, he understands what you're going through, where you're coming from, the pain and the suffering. And I think to a point, perhaps the best part of good that comes from this is that there's not a lot of male voices out there talking about this.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of men deep diving into this because, frankly, that involves emotions. And it's not something that we as men like to give into as much. But I found that through reliving those emotions and letting those emotions come back up again and again and again, that there was a healing that was taking place that I would have never reached if it hadn't have been for the fact that, just like tonight, as I tell that story and my heart gets opened up again, and those emotions that are triggers from past tragedies begin to come back up again, that process began to bring me healing in such a way that I can't necessarily explain it, but I'll tell you that it definitely doesn't cause me any pause to tell the story again and again and again. Because oftentimes it's easy for us as humans to get stuck on the fact that we're going through something. And because we're going through something, there's no way anybody else has gone through the exact same thing.
No.
There's no way somebody else has felt that particular type of isolation, that particular type of pain, that particular type of transgression, whatever it is. And yet, just as I said, that when you are brought into this club of infant loss and you think you're the only one, you realize that you open the door to the biggest surprise party of your life. And guess what? You've probably got more friends in that group than you ever realized. And so for me to speak up, for me to talk to guys, to girls, gals, to man and wife, to mom and dad, there's a transformation that comes from people who realize that there's somebody else out there that understands that to that degree. And I'm not sitting here telling you that I'm the best voice for it. I'm not sitting here telling you that I've got all the answers. I'm not sitting here telling you any of that stuff. I'm telling you that if you have a story, if you have a testimony, if you have something that's given to you to go through, and you get the opportunity to tell somebody else that you came through the other side, I feel like you're obligated to that. I feel like the experiences that we go through, they're not just for us, they're also for the people who come behind us. Because if you look back years and years and years and years ago to the first people who began to move across this country and begin to move west and begin to shape the United States into what it is today, they had to endure pretty hard stuff so that the person behind them could have it a little bit easier. And in such a thing as infant loss, I'm reminded to the fact that A child that loses its parents is an orphan, and a husband or a wife that loses their spouse is a widow. There is no name, there is no title given to a parent who loses a child. It's just not meant to be. There's no explanation for that. There's nothing to hide under as far as a title or as far as a cliche, because this is something that hits at the core base of who you are, because you grow up seeing people older than you die. You grow up seeing people the same age as you die. You grow up seeing people a little bit younger than you pass away. But you never get it in your mind that you're about to bury your child. You're about to say goodbye to something that you hoped for. And yet, through all of that, there is somewhere, there's a bright side. If I can sit here, if somebody else could sit here in this chair in the same manner and sit there and say, hey, been through this, been through that, and came out on the other side, then that means there's hope for the person behind me that comes through this. And so if I can tell my story 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, and it reaches one person each time it gets told, that's a success. Every single time, that's a success. And so for somebody to sit there and go, Luke, what good came out of that? I tell them, the good that came out of that is that I'm here to throw you a lifeline. I'm here to throw you a rope. I'm here to tell you you can make it out of this. The opportunities that I have had to come forth and tell my story, not everybody gets those opportunities. And even my opportunities were kind of put to a halt whenever the big C word came around and shut everybody down last year. Hospitals aren't necessarily allowing that type of therapy to happen because it's groups of people. And so there's been squelches, so to speak, on that end. But yet, the hits didn't stop coming. There's still people out there losing. There's still people out there suffering these losses. And yet, I still have the opportunities through friends, through a Zoom call, through a phone call, through a text thread, to be able to still sit there and tell people that there's hope on the other end of this. Maybe there's another child coming along the way. Maybe there's better days coming in the form of something that you hope for. But maybe there's not. But it's still okay, because in that moment where you felt the most overwhelming despair grip your soul, grip your heart, in that moment where you felt like you wished the earth would just open up and swallow you, you made it through that. You came through that. And in those moments where you felt like life had just ended, honestly, life was just getting restarted. Life was just taking the next step up. And if we can look back at that and say there was a purpose for that, then it gives meaning, and we look for that purpose. We want that meaning. We want to know that something wasn't in vain. We want to know that something wasn't wasted. But I can assure you that just as God gave his only begotten Son, he knows that pain. And so maybe he brings somebody like me to come along and say, hey, you're going to make it. It's going to be okay. It won't be all right forever. For forever, as long as you can remember, you're going to focus on that. It's going to come back.
Yeah.
It's going to kick you in the gut. Because it did it again to me tonight. And it's been 8+ years. But I still know that I came out on the other side. And now God's using me as a voice to tell other people, you can make it to the other side.
He gave you a voice when you got to the other side.
Absolutely.
For sure. I've got a selfish question.
Go for it.
You talking about all this happening and...
Is it me? Hold on, babe.
Oh, you know what it is. Hold on. My Bluetooth.
What is it?
It was my phone ringing through my Bluetooth. All right, start that one over and you got a selfish question.
I'm just going to go back to there probably. So I got a selfish question. You've been through all this pain and you've been through miscarriage, you've been through divorce, and you named a statistic that people that have had miscarriages are more likely to be divorced. And if something hits close to home, you're 8+ years back from that, 4 to 5 years from divorce. I mean, what would be your advice looking back?
Probably my biggest piece of advice is to find your people. And my biggest piece of advice to anybody who is witnessing this going on, friends, family, you know somebody who has suffered a loss, rally around them. And don't just rally around them for the first week, the second week. Continually check in on them until they tell you, I'm good for now. And be ready for the moments when something comes along and triggers that again. You don't have to know what to say. In fact, in most cases, it's probably better that you don't know what to say. Because when you're hurt like that, really all you want to do is just get it off your chest. You don't necessarily need an answer because the answer to why doesn't solve what happened. Even if we could answer why. So don't isolate yourself. Reach out, speak up. Even if it's a surprise pregnancy that you found out from the surprise loss, reach out. You're not meant to go through life alone. And to that degree, you're not meant to suffer alone either. If God has put family in your life, if God has put friends that are like family in your life, if God has given you a spouse, if God has given you all of these different outlets to share life with, don't be afraid to reach out and say, I need help. Don't be afraid to grab onto somebody and say, I'm struggling today. Because even if they don't understand, the fact that you now know you have somebody there beside you is going to make it that much easier. And it's going to give you the opportunity to step back and take a deep breath. And so to the person who's facing that, to the person who's struggling with that, to the person who's looking for the answer, reach out and find somebody. You've got a friend, you've got a family, reach out to somebody. And I would say that's on every account of every struggle, whether it's addiction, whether it's a sickness, whether it's a loss, whether it's whatever. If you find yourself struggling, reach out, because the Bible tells us that 2 people are better than 1. And that's not just on the account of man and wife. That's on the account of if one person's walking down the highway and they get robbed, they can't protect themselves. But if there's 2, that's a deterrent already. So don't allow despair to begin to sink into the point where you withdraw and drown in that despair. Reach out, because there's somebody in your circle. I can guarantee you there's somebody in your circle that's going to know what to do, or they're going to know to stay right there beside you. And in the end, to the age-old question that I've heard a million times, how did you do it? I didn't. We did. Me and my friends. Me and God. Me and the countless family members that came up beside me and continue to still be there through every sequential loss after that. So find somebody.
Oh, you mentioned the other loss, and I mean, you've been, as Jess always says, you've been through the fire, and in a big way in this testimony. But as we step further in your life after that, God, he tests you yet again with the loss of your dad. And I admire you for being able to sit here and tell both these stories, because I know that it's got to be tough. And I know your dad was a huge support and a huge strength for you. And the way you told that story today, meant a lot to me, and I'd like to hear it again.
Sure. So earlier this year, June the 10th, my dad was called home. And it wasn't necessarily something that I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I definitely wasn't expecting it. The prior week, I got a phone call from my stepmom, and she said that Dad had been taken to the hospital via ambulance. And I didn't realize that he had been sick for the last week or 2 because he didn't tell me. And as I would call him and check in on him, he kept that close because he didn't want to worry me. And yet now I'm very worried because he's in the hospital. And that night, at about midnight, I got another phone call. And it's my stepmom again saying they've moved him from Brady to San Angelo. And I said, why? And she said they found spots on his lungs. And so the whirlwind after that, you find out that it's not just in the lungs, it's in the liver, it's in the adrenal gland. And they don't really know how far advanced it is either. And the tests go out and they send off biopsies, and they tell me, they said, just realize that we've asked for point of origin, so this test is going to take a little bit longer to get back. These results are going to take longer to get back. But even still, you're thinking you've got weeks or months. And reached out to all of my siblings, and I've got 2 older brothers and a younger sister, and got everybody filled in, got everybody on the same page, so to speak, and we're going to figure this out. We're going to tackle it. It's going to be okay. He went into the hospital on a Thursday. And by the following Wednesday, you knew things were pretty bad. And that morning he woke up and he was just in a really bad state. Doctors suspected that maybe he'd had a stroke. And mind you, to this point, I still have not made it to the hospital yet because I'm in Austin. He's in San Angelo. We're talking a 3.5 hour, 4-hour drive. And Dad the whole time telling me, nope, you don't need to come up here because it's okay. Everything's fine. We don't even have a diagnosis yet. Once we get a diagnosis, then you feel free to come on up here and we'll figure this out. And so that Wednesday morning, tried to get a hold of him, couldn't get a hold of him on his cell phone, tried to get a hold of him in his room, couldn't get a hold of him in his room. Continued to try throughout the morning, and finally I was able to get a hold of a nurse. And so the nurse says, hey, this phone call is actually for you, Daryl, and hands the phone to my dad, and he's very just out of it and doesn't really know, he doesn't really have the wherewithal to tell me what's going on. So he hands the phone back to the nurse and tell him what's going on. And so this is where she begins to tell me there's a possibility he's had a stroke. We're sending him in for a CAT scan and see what that shows us. In the meantime, we're going to back him off of his pain meds a little bit and see if that doesn't help. And she said, we'll keep you posted. All right. So sure enough, later that afternoon, early evening, she called me up and said, so the CAT scan didn't come back anything conclusive, so we're going to send him for an MRI. And so we talked through that whole panel of questions, and at that point she said, would you like to talk to him? He's sitting up, he's watching TV, he's a lot more lucid than he was earlier. And I said, sure, I would love to talk to him. So we sat there and we talked for a few minutes, and I can tell he's tired, I can tell he's worn out. And so I go to conclude that phone call, and Dad and I always had this little cadence that we would go back and forth on at the end of every phone call, and so I tried to initiate that, and he just wasn't taking the bait. And so I told him, I said, well, instead of coming down this weekend as we had planned, I said, I'm coming down tomorrow, and I'll be there tomorrow morning. And he said, okay. Didn't fight me. Didn't try. So I told him, I said, well, I love you bunches, and I know you can handle it, and I'll talk to you later. And as I got ready to hang up the phone, in a very clear voice, he said, hey. I said, yes, sir. He said, I sure do love you. And little did I know that those would be the last words that he said to me. Because shortly after 2 a.m., I got the phone call that he was gone. And Dad was my biggest supporter, my loudest fan, my confidant, my rock. And just like that, he's gone. And I'm sitting there on the bedroom floor, and I'm getting ready to start making phone calls that I don't want to make. And my roommate Mike steps in, and he said, let's pray. I said, okay. And so he prayed, And as he wrapped up his prayer, I began to pray. And I said, God, I know that you're sovereign, and I know that you have a plan for everything. And I know that somehow good's going to come of this. But I'm going to be honest. This hurts. And it hurts worse than I have felt in a long time. And I would appreciate if you would just show up and show me that you're in control here. Would you assure me that you've got your hand on this? And sure enough, later that morning as word began to get out to the church, my phone began to light up like a Christmas tree. And it was text message after text message and phone call after phone call and email after email. And I said, all right, heard you loud and clear. You got this. You're still there. Went through the whole funeral arrangements, went through the funeral itself. Gave a speech that I never wanted to give. Had to come up with words that I never wanted to come up with. And yet, even though I'm a hot mess up at that podium and just falling to pieces the whole time, I'm able to tell the people gathered there that that man that was my biggest everything had done nothing but show anybody that ever came in contact with him the ultimate friendship, the ultimate grace, the ultimate whatever. Dad was simply not somebody that held a grudge, and if he did, it wasn't for very long. And the only thing that I could really say at that point was, from this point we go on and we remember everything that he ever said. We remember any time he ever spoke encouragement, any time he ever spoke wisdom, any time he ever spoke anything that uplifted. Remember that. And man, do I ever have a lot of those memories. Because at my darkest moments of losing my daughter, he was there to say, son, I can't tell you that I know what you're going through. But I can tell you that now's the time that you lean in to God more than you ever have before. And on my divorce, the same thing. I can tell you that I've been through what you've been through, but I can't tell you how to get through it other than to lean on God and seek His wisdom and find His grace for everything that you want to blame yourself for. And yet, now I don't have that same voice. At least I don't have him on the end of a phone call. I don't have him standing in front of me, but I have him in my head. And I can play some of those conversations over and over and over again and still hear that voice just as clear as ever, saying, son, you're going to get through it. You're going to be okay. It doesn't always make it easier, but again, I know that there's purpose to everything. And from that prayer of God show up, I didn't mention to her that I was going to tell this story, but I know she won't mind. My sister hasn't been in the church for a long time. I should say hadn't. And through interactions of people from my church showing up and reaching out to her after that, she began to reach out to me and say, I need to find a church. She's up in Indianapolis. And so I got together with our pastor and we found a couple of churches up in the area and we got her into one. And the story behind that of how God just pursued her for that end that's a story. But she could look back and see that God's hand was there to pluck her out of that part of losing dad and getting her into a family, getting her into a church family that rallies around her at this point. And I realized in that moment that God, after he answered that prayer through the church responding, he said, I'm not done. And then he brings my sister back into the church. And I can't tell you how awesome that really is. Because, again, in those situations where I feel like I'm at my wit's end, he's still there. He's still in control. He's still moving. He's still changing the landscape. And what's to come, I can only imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And yet, I can't hardly wait.
Yep. I think what's so amazing about, too, all you said and all the message that you've given us is that I don't think you even realize that you replaced your dad's voice, that it's not necessarily for a child, but it's for all of us. I mean, you just replaced his voice. I don't think you even really realize that that's the reason that you're here today. I really believe that.
I'll say thank you.
Well, what an amazing story. I mean, where do you even go from here? And I mean, babe, what do you have to say? Can you say? She's just gonna laugh at me.
I'm gonna kill you.
I know. Well, I don't even know where to go with it. Just it's an amazing story, and
it's an honor.
It is an honor, and thank you so much for being here and for being willing to open yourself up to pain and heartache to get that message across that benefits us two sitting here as much as anybody that could even listen, and for the selflessness and taking the time and being willing to do it, and just a big thank you, and we really look forward to everybody getting to hear this story.
Yeah, thank you for leaning into us when we needed you.
It's been an honor on my end, even because I look at every opportunity that I've ever gotten to lean in with anybody, and I can only ever say thank you to God for allowing those opportunities to come up. They're not pleasant. By no means are they pleasant. By no means do they bring any significant good feelings even. And yet, God still brings beauty from ashes. And he's still bringing beauty from ashes. And he's going to continue to bring beauty from ashes.
Well, thank you again so much for being here and all the words and we can't say it enough how much we appreciate you being here. Babe, what else you got?
I don't know if you mean.
Well, as the song says, the road goes on forever, and the party never ends.
I love you.
I love you too.
We sure appreciate y'all listening today. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can search for us, Moving On Podcast. That's 3 words, on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. We would love to hear from you. With ways you're figuring out how to drop the ropes in each of your own lives, and even ways that you're not, hell, that's just as entertaining to us. See you in a couple of weeks.